we know that there's an admission of the black budget, and for example, in 2019, Trump asked for $81 billion, and in previous years, there's anywhere between like 30 to 50 billion in the past 10 years or so has been spent each year on the black budget, and this is kind of what's, hey, here public, this is what is going on, and these are usually programs that are coming out of the Department of Defense and so forth that ideally they kind of push this, but for national security we can't really tell you, which, there are ways you can make a justification for why they would say that and all that sort of stuff. But investigations have led to something much deeper, and I think to sort of start this off and to start to get a little bit into the secrecy of these black budget programs and really start understanding what's the difference between the acknowledged budget and the somewhat acknowledged programs, i.e. the vagueness that's put towards, hey, these are spent on doing certain things within the Department of Defense, for example, versus the unacknowledged programs, the money that's going in there, and what's really happening in there, because this is something that is often not talked about. You got the smoke screen of admission, hey, here's the black budget, here's what we're spending. Then you have what's actually going on, which is what we're going to really focus on here today. But to start that, we got to kind of get into, I believe it's a Paul Hellyer quote, where he's actually trying to draw attention to the fact that, hey, there's a veil of secrecy here that's happening. And we need to start to address that. So in this quote, where is he and who's he addressing?
This quote was given, I think, around 2011, 2012, something like that, at the University of Toronto. It was an exopolitics conference, so they're discussing, secret space programs, which we're going to get into later. And it's a great little quote here addressing the black budget. And he's obviously former Canadian defense minister, so he knows a thing or two about this. So I'll just play it right here.
The veil of secrecy must be lifted, and it has to be lifted now, before it's too late. It is ironic that the U.S. would begin a devastating war, allegedly in search of weapons of mass destruction, when the most worrisome developments in this field are occurring in your own backyard. It is ironic that the U.S. should be fighting monstrously expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, allegedly to bring democracy to those two countries, when it itself can no longer legitimately claim to be called a democracy, when trillions, and I mean thousands of billions of dollars, have been spent on projects about which both the Congress and the Commander-in-Chief have been kept deliberately in the dark.
So it's a powerful quote there, going back to, for me, what hits me is the in your own backyard. Right. The idea of the media and all this sort of stuff, we're always pushing for what's happening in another country or what we're going to go do in another country. And so much focus is on that. And if there's a focus on inside the country, it's really about sort of these like trivial issues related to how, various policies and so forth at a just a very societal level keep people divided and so forth. Like when we talk about abortion and when we talk about all these, different things related to healthcare and stuff, right? Those are still important things, but we rarely get into some of these deeper discussions. And it's like, but this is where so much money is going. This is where so much justification for war is going. This is where so much of this stuff is happening, and we're just not having this discussion. And this veil of secrecy has to be lifted.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. And it's not like it's just one person saying this, right?
Yeah.
We have investigations. We'll get to that later, but Paul Hellyer is a great example, and I have some other quotes here from, it's a common theme throughout history. Here's a great quote from President Roosevelt, who was the 26th President of the United States. And he said, "Behind the ostensible government sits enthroned an invisible government owing no allegiance and acknowledging no responsibility to the people. To destroy this invisible government, to befoul the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics is the first task of the statesmanship of the day." So, that's one example. Here's another great quote from the very first British MP, Benjamin Disraeli. He said in his book called Coningsby, Chapter 4, page 15. Book 4, Chapter 15, page 131. "The world is governed by very different personages to what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes." There's There's another great quote from Senator Daniel K. Inouye, if I'm pronouncing that right. He was the highest ranking Asian American politician in United States history. And here's what he had to say.
A shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
So there's that. I mean, there's so many examples. I'm just going to...
But just going off that one for a second before we continue, it's just this idea of, okay, we've established that in the first couple there, I mean, Hellyer has talked about it, and the next two quotes that you read talk about it. It's like, well, obviously there's... The key thing in unpacking this, it's like, okay, you have this black budget, right? And what we're going to get to, and we're going to reveal, but we wanted to kind of set the table a little bit here before we get into this revelation so we can keep something in our minds here. Because what's ultimately going to happen as we go through this segment is there's going to be this question of, okay, but who's making these decisions? Okay, but now that we know that there's actually way more money that's unaccounted for, whose money is that? Where does that come from? And why is this happening? And what's going on here? And what's interesting about these quotes is it starts to show us that people recognize, people in power, people who've been there, people who've seen it firsthand, are recognizing that behind the government, the elected government, there are interests that nobody elects, that is running the show, that has their own militaries, that has their own decision-making processes, that has their own budgets, their own balances, that come from the public, money, tax-paying dollars, but nobody's allowed to ask anything about it. And this is an important thing to just keep in our minds as we continue to unpack this, because the reality of the situation, when people say they, when people say the deep state, when people say the people that are, pulling the strings and doing this sort of stuff, this is where we're starting to see what this really means and what this looks like. It's a shadowy group of individuals that are not elected, that people recognize exist, and that as we continue to unpack this, you're going to see there's a lot of weird stuff going on here, where essentially the money that's being collected, that we always ask ourselves the questions, where the heck are these tax dollars going, or what's actually happening? We're going to start to see that a little bit further.
Right. And, I thought I should get this quote in too because it's another great one. It's from Mayor John F. Hyland. He was a former mayor of New York City back in the day, and he said, "The real menace of our republic is the invisible government, which, like a giant octopus, sprawls its slimy legs over our cities, states, and nation. The little, I can't pronounce this word, coterie of powerful international bankers virtually run the United States government for their own selfish purposes. They practically control both parties, control the majority of the newspapers and magazines in this country. And they use the columns of these papers to club into submission or drive out of office public officials who refuse to do the bidding of the powerful corrupt cliques which compose the invisible government." So there's another one, that famous speech by John F. Kennedy called out, secrecy and the invisible government as well. I mean, it's a common theme throughout history.
Absolutely.
And, if we look at our intelligence agencies, for example, it's another great example.
Yes, perfect example.
The National Security Agency was founded in 1952, but its existence was hidden until the mid-1960s. Even more secretive, the National Reconnaissance Office, which was founded in 1960, but that actually remained completely secret for 30 years. So it makes you wonder,
what else is secret?
What else is secret today? Right.
And this is what becomes interesting, right? Is obviously you can sort of unpack this a little bit and say, okay, well maybe with, for example, the National Reconnaissance Office, 30 years of secrecy, maybe that's part of where, the black budget is going, where it's like, oh, well, we asked for, say, $30 billion this year, and, part of it went into that, and every single year, part of it was building that. Oh, it's for national security, and that's why we didn't tell you. And now, okay, we can tell you because we've got a good foothold, got a good understanding of what's going on. Therefore, we can start telling you what's happening, and, here's our revelation of that. But we're going to find out here that that is nowhere near all that's going on. Not only that, but we're starting to find that there's trillions of dollars missing here when it comes to the black budget. And here we are on one side sort of arguing about how we're going to implement some new policy and spend X amount of billions of dollars or potentially trillions of dollars a year on a new idea, when in reality there's trillions upon trillions, which is now what we're going to get into.